Hi, this is Greg at Track 25. Welcome to our series on pushing the limits of Pro Tools Intro and Live Lite. Today, we tackled Dolby Atmos mixing. We have some really high goals here, not just sending a few tracks to objects. We couldn't attempt Atmos until we had our channel count solution in place. Our old 2011 iMac will need a slight upgrade for this step. We'll use this Mac Mini from 2012, again using OpenCore to install Ventura. We're going to use Fiedler's Dolby Atmos Composer Essential, the free version of their flagship Atmos workflow. Check out their site for tutorials because today we will focus specifically on our Lite apps. From Part 2, we managed 20 tracks in Pro Tools Intro. For this demo, we're adding the Beam plugin to every channel and adding the Composer plugin to the master, along with a loudness meter. Our various drum elements are assigned to the bed, and we have 15 stereo tracks assigned as objects. Also from Part 2, we had 40 mono channels in stereo strips using multi-mono plugins. The Beam plugin does not support multi-mono, so we'll use the AU version inside a multi-mono instance of Patchwork. Here we have all 40 channels assigned as mono objects. In Part 4, we used Patchwork for some track playback. We start with 4 stereo synth tracks inside Audio Player plugins, then add level controls, followed by Beam plugins. We then add level controls for feeding a down mix into a chorus plugin, which also has its own Beam instance. This is what it looks like in action. In this demo, we have a stereo send to bus 21 and 22, feeding an aux track. This aux has a spring reverb and its own Beam instance. The playback source is 8 mono background vocal tracks inside a Patchwork pod. The setup starts with 8 mono audio players. These feed individual EQs. Then we have level controls, which set levels going into individual Beam plugins. There are additional level and pan controls to create a stereo mix for sending into the spring reverb via the aux send system. This is what it looks like in action. Here we have a song on a track and a send setup. The audio track has its own Beam plugin. The aux track has a stereo reverb plugin that also has its own Beam plugin. Later in the plugin chain, we have an audio player with a piano track that also has its own Beam plugin. We continue with a reverb plugin that also has its own Beam plugin. This is what it looks like in action. Here we have a song on an audio track with its own instance of Beam. Sitting in the top of the master track, we have our playback pod from earlier, with 4 synth tracks, Beam plugins, and chorus. This is what it looks like in action. Again, we have a song on a track and a send setup. Instead of a reverb plugin on our aux, we have a custom patchwork reverb setup. We start with an input EQ and channel adjustments, followed by 4 stereo reverbs, then level controls into Beam plugins. This is what it looks like in action. Here's a similar setup with an aux, a song, and a patchwork instance with 4 stereo reverbs. In this patchwork instance, however, we will adjust the I/O settings for 7.1 configuration. Each of our reverb instances will need audio routing adjustments to spread them out across 7.1 channels. We also have adjustments for levels and widths. Following all this is our Beam plugin, which is also inside our 7.1 environment. In our Beam plugin, we see an 8-channel source. We'll mute the LFE. This is what it looks like in action. Here again, we have our aux send and our song track with its own Beam plugin. In our aux, we have a different patchwork reverb setup. Like before, we'll create a 7.1 environment, but instead of 4 stereo reverbs, we'll insert a 7.1 instance of HD cart. Our controls adjust level outputs in pairs. As before, our Beam plugin is inserted into a 7.1 system. This is what it looks like in action. Continuing on with the same session, we'll make some changes in the Composer plugin. We'll change the output config to 7.1. We'll disconnect our piano beam. We'll change our export files for WAV only, set some in and out times, and choose Export. We'll call this file Print. As we play back our session, Composer is capturing our reverb to a 7.1 file. Note the percentage progress at the bottom. With our export complete, we can re-enable our piano beam and return to our patchwork setup. we'll add our audio player, noting that it's inside our 7.1 environment, and choose our 7.1 print file we just created. Our 7.1 file plays back. We can now delete our CPU intensive reverb plugin. This is what it looks like in action. Here we have a low-pass filtered pink noise file on a track assigned to a mono bus called LFE, and our aux track picks up the bus where we have this small patchwork instance. We set up our environment to be 5.1 this time. We make a special route in our level control, sourcing only channel 1 and rerouting to channel 4. Note our Beam plugin is also a 5.1 instance. Inside Beam, we simply disable all 5 main channels, leaving only the LFE. This is what it looks like in action. This is our first demo again, but we now have a new audio file. It's 2 mono master files from our stereo mix, 1 channel of full mix and 1 channel just drums and bass. We send this track directly to a bus called SC. Across all channels in the session, we now have an instance of BXXL compression, and we select our sidechain key. We tell our bands to use the sidechain, and we select External. We can see the sidechain signal arriving at the bottom. If we raise the level of the SC file, the compression amount increases. We can see the gain reduction across all other channels as well. Here's how we set up the same compressor within a patchwork instance. Select the key source, set the bands to use the sidechain signal, select External as the sidechain source. The compression follows the SC signal just like the native tracks. Let's start the live Lite setup with an empty drum rack. Then drop another drum rack onto a pad. Into the devices chain, we'll place our patchwork instance. As before in Part 5, these will be simple instances just to play the track on the timeline. We can expand the rack to see the chain. Into this nested drum rack, we'll add our instance of Beam. Let's give it a more useful name. With the Beam plugin downstream of our player, we can use the standard live fader instead of Beam. This is our 43-pair demo from Part 5 with groups of tracks on pads. On the master, we have our composer and loudness meter. We've placed beam instances on both effects returns. We also have beam plugins at the end of each nested drum rack. If we expand our rack, we can see 2 sends in each chain. We forward these 2 effect sends to the main returns using utility plugins. Let's unfold the entire session. This is what it looks like in action. The bass and drums are assigned to the bed along with the effects. In this next demo, our master is the same as before with the composer and the loudness meter, but note we now have 40 pairs, no longer grouped into 7 nested racks, but into 40 nested racks. You can see the 40 pads active now instead of 7. This is what it looks like in action. Once again, here is our 43-pair session with 7 groups in 7 nested racks. Our composer in the master track looks the same. In each nested rack, however, we now have our BX-XL compressor plugin. We've also added our sidechain source file from earlier to use as our sidechain signal, along with a utility effect for gain adjustment. We need to select our source in each compressor instance. We also need to make sure our sidechain is set to external. We also make sure our bands are set to key off the sidechain. When we play our track, we see the incoming sidechain source. We can have more or less compression by modifying our utility gain control on the SC channel. In this last demo, we see our 7 nested racks with groups and beams on our returns. But for this session, we need to introduce a special helper plugin. Bidual from Plug. Similar to Patchwork, Bidual is a construction kit plugin. It can host processes and plugins, allowing you to craft things custom wired to your requirements. In our last nested drum rack, we add an instance of Bidual as our third effects chain. Here's what it looks like inside our simple Bidual setup. We first have a 9.1 instance of HD cart. Note the elevation labels on the meters. We follow that with our instance of Beam, which is aware of its 16-channel environment and uses all 16 signals. On the master module, we see our Bidual instance assigned as a 16-channel object. That brings us to the end of this bonus segment of our series. We hope you enjoy getting the most out of Pro Tools Intro in Live Lite, now with Atmos. This is Greg from Track 25. See you next time.